Good evening, and welcome to the History Lecture Series. Tonight, Professor Margaret O'Mara will be giving the third of 4 lectures on key presidential elections of the 20th century. My name is Lynn Thomas, and I'm the chair of the History Department. And it's wonderful to see so many alumni and friends of the department here tonight. Thank you all for coming. As you know, if you've come to any of the 2 previous lectures, Margaret is an accomplished historian of the 20th century American history. She specializes in urban and political history. But before she earned her PhD and became an academic, she spent a couple years as a staff member in the Clinton-Gore White House. Next Tuesday, I believe, we'll be hearing about some of her first-hand experiences as part of the 1992 presidential campaign, as well as the political era that it inaugurated. Tonight, however, is all about 1968. 1968, a year that immediately conjures images or perhaps memories of political protests and flower power, of baby boomers, and of go-go boots. It was also the year of an incredibly contentious and close presidential election. To tell us about this, please join me in welcoming back to the stage Professor Margaret O'Mara. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Welcome back for lecture number 3. As you can sense from some of the music that you heard playing as you came in earlier, we are moving into a period that is not all that long ago. And tonight I'll tell some stories that you may know well and others that you might not know. We'll put these together into a greater whole and look back with historical perspective on what happened, why it happened, and what it means. On March 31st, 1968, President Lyndon B. Johnson gave a televised address to the nation. His subject was the Vietnam War, which by this time had escalated into a bloody conflict involving over 500,000 American soldiers. Johnson looked tired and old. The glare of the television lights showed the deep lines etched in his forehead. At the very end of his speech, he made an announcement. Because of the importance of resolving the Vietnam conflict, he said, quote, "I do not believe that I should devote an hour or day of my time to any personal partisan causes. Accordingly, I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president." And that was it. Johnson, the master of the Senate, the consummate politician, the man who had been among the most powerful deal makers and power brokers in post-war Washington. He was not running for re-election in 1968. This scenario was hard to imagine 4 years earlier. In November 1964, Johnson had won a landslide victory over his Republican challenger for the White House, conservative Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. Goldwater was a cold warrior, a fiscal conservative. He believed in strong defense, but in limited government otherwise. He mocked the idea that the U.S. could have a peaceful coexistence with the USSR. He condemned the Democrats for being willing to negotiate with the Soviets. He and his supporters found similar problems with the Republican establishment and one of its leading political lights, New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller. In the early months of the 1964 campaign, the moderate Rockefeller was considered the most likely Republican nominee. Goldwater surprised them all when he won the Republican nomination. His supporters not only included the very young, but a range of passionate grassroots activists who had not previously had as much of a voice in national Republican politics. It included Sunbelt suburbanites anti-communist crusaders, and small government conservatives. Johnson had run on a very different vision, backed by a different set of interests. The Democratic Party of 1964 was a party built by the New Deal, whose programs had created a strong working class base for the party, particularly in the large industrial regions of the Northeast and the Midwest. As you'll recall, in 1912 and 1932, these areas used to be Republican strongholds. African Americans migrated to the Democratic column during the Roosevelt years as well, and Lyndon Johnson's signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 cemented this loyalty, as well as the support of white liberals. But it marked the disintegration of another critical bloc of the Democratic Party, racially conservative white Southerners. Democratic leaders like Johnson epitomized Cold War-era consensus liberalism, and Republicans like Nelson Rockefeller could be considered consensus liberals of a sort as well. They believed in the welfare state, in an active federal government. They believed in strong defense and containment of the power of the Soviet Union. Containment, after all, was why America got so involved in Vietnam. It was sort of a neo-progressivism, believing government by enlightened experts could win out over backwards small government and states' rights activists. And it was a politics that matched the spirit of the post-war era. From 1945 forward, the United States had experienced an extraordinary and unprecedented run of prosperity. It was a prosperity built on big things, big organizations, big institutions, big corporations, big labor unions, big and big spending government, and a high-stakes struggle with one big enemy, the Soviet Union. Consensus liberalism was the big politics that matched this era. It presumed that Americans shared the same set of values and had a shared destiny. It was built on a foundation forged through the struggle of the Great Depression and World War II. The idea that Americans should be in it together and that every citizen should be treated equally. The Johnson campaign was successful in good part because it preyed on people's fears that Barry Goldwater was playing to small prejudices rather than fighting for big shared goals. That his extremism represented the interests of only a few, not the many. Perhaps the artifact that best sums up the Johnson message against Goldwater is what became the most famous political commercial of all time. Let's take a look.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9,
6 to make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
This commercial aired only once. But after its airing, all the network news outlets ran it again and again and again, so we got lots of free media. And it's still getting free media in 2012. And it wasn't even the most incendiary commercial the campaign had in its arsenal. The 1964 election results seemed to prove that the rest of the country agreed that Goldwater was not the right person to have his finger on the nuclear button. The tale of 1964 versus 1968 shows us how quickly things can turn in politics. How and why they did that is what I'm going to talk about tonight. One way to think about 1968 is that it's a mirror image of the election of 1912, which was the election where we started this series. Both 1912 and 1968 were years of economic and social tumult. The foundations of the economy were shifting. Certain regions of the country were winning, others were losing out. Traditional values and institutions were being challenged by a new generation. The definition of who was American was being challenged by new arrivals, by new voices in the political process. Authority was being questioned. And violent events were shaking people's sense of stability and personal safety. In 1912, conservative factions in both parties found themselves marginalized, left behind popular sentiment that was swinging towards progressive causes, the creation of a bolder, a larger government. Conservatism, as it existed in the 19th century, began to destruct. More progressive factions in both parties in 1912 shifted the political conversation towards more activist, interventionist policy solutions. And in doing so, they started to construct a new strain of liberalism, one that established as its base premise that the government had a responsibility to ensure the economic welfare of all citizens. And these progressive ideas were institutionalized by the New Deal. In 1968, this order broke down, which is what gets us to why 1968 was a pivotal election. 1, the liberals destruct. 2, the conservatives construct a new politics. And 3, television brings it all into American living rooms. So let's explore why. The problem was Vietnam. By early 1966, it was becoming clear to Lyndon Johnson that he could not wage war and push forward his domestic agenda, because he had used his 1964 electoral mandate to make some really bold policy moves. He succeeded in pushing through a big tax cut. He succeeded in starting some big programs designed to ensure American prosperity would be shared more widely, an agenda he called the Great Society. Now, some of these programs didn't survive the 60s, and others did, most notably Medicare. This high-spend, low-tax regime did not take into account the spiraling costs of Vietnam. And in a January 1966 speech, Johnson acknowledged this problem, saying to the American people, because of Vietnam, we cannot do all that we should or all that we would like to do. Other changes were brewing. One was demographic and cultural. The baby boom after World War II had produced a huge generation of young people who had grown up in an America more affluent, more educated, and more comfortable than any period before in its history. Time magazine named the under 25 generation its Man of the Year in 1967. Inside, its undoubtedly male reporters wrote, quote, "This is not just a new generation, but a new kind of generation. He is the man who will land on the moon, cure cancer and the common cold, lay out blight-proof, smog-free cities, enrich the underdeveloped world, and no doubt write finis to poverty and war." Whew, tall order. We getting around to that yet? But these young people weren't thinking they'd solve the world's problems on their parents' terms or Time magazine's terms. In fact, they thought part of the problem was the things their parents' generation had done in the first place. By 1967, they were growing their hair long, dropping out, marching and striking, condemning their political leaders for doing far too little to stop the carnage in Vietnam, to address racial discrimination, and fix economic inequality. A rallying cry that captured this group was, "Don't trust anyone over 30. For those who were around then, has your perspective changed? Anyone? No? For this under 25 generation, the crisis was deeply personal. In today's era of an all-volunteer military, it is hard to fully understand the degree to which mandatory conscription, the draft, into an unpopular war transformed young people's lives and America's politics. As the conflict raged and American involvement escalated, fewer and fewer young men could escape the threat of the draft. In 1965, college students with bad grades could no longer defer being called up. In 1967, student deferments were abolished altogether. The draft radicalized young people against the war. And it radicalized their parents, their pastors, their teachers. The draft was critical to understanding the degree to which the entire American political spectrum of the late 1960s was several notches to the left of where it had ever been before. The people on the left were farther to the left. The moderate middle was actually more liberal than not. And even the conservative right was far more moderate than the right-wing politics of later decades. Middle class, upper class, suburban, small town, ordinary Americans were against the war and against the men who created it because it was their kids, their sons, who might have to go fight it, whether they wanted to or not. Another shift was occurring in the civil rights movement. The Federal Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts had remedied political and legal injustices, but they had done little to help the deep economic inequality and daily discrimination faced by communities of color. This frustration spilled out vividly and violently in poor black neighborhoods. The summer of 1967 saw two explosions of violence unmatched in size and devastation, one in Newark, New Jersey, and another in Detroit a week and a half later. Some in the new generation of African Americans began to be impatient with the nonviolent tactics of Martin Luther King Jr. and his allies. They were frustrated with alliances with white liberals who could sympathize with the cause of racial equity but never had to experience discrimination themselves. Stokely Carmichael, an activist who had participated in the freedom rides alongside white college students in the early 1960s, was one leader of the new Black Power movement that placed economic injustice front and center and took a more militant approach to the civil rights struggle. As Carmichael put it, you can't form a coalition with people who are economically secure. College students are economically secure. They've already got their wealth, and we are fighting to get ours. And for us to get it, it is going to mean tearing down their system, and they are not willing to work for their own destruction. I cite Carmichael here because he's one of many people who are articulating a new sort of identity politics. There was the antithesis of the big politics of Cold War consensus liberalism. This wasn't a vision of we're all in this together, where the government ensures universal welfare, equal rights, where everyone is American first and other things later. This was a vision of an America that was diverse, an America that was unjust, and where different groups didn't necessarily see eye to eye. The first sign that these changes were going to have a big political impact surfaced in California. As goes California, so goes the nation. California's Democratic governor, Pat Brown, was one of the most powerful liberal politicians of his generation. He was popular. He seemed unbeatable. In 1962, Richard Nixon had ran against him and lost. Coming on the heels of Nixon's loss to John F. Kennedy in 1960, it seemed like this was the end of Nixon's political career. This is the famous press conference that Nixon gave after his defeat, saying, "You won't have Richard M. Nixon to kick around anymore." But in 1964 and 1965, things started to happen. At the University of California, students walked out of classes, held mass demonstrations to protest the university's restrictions on on-campus political activity. In the largely black neighborhood of Watts in Los Angeles, it was convulsed by violent rebellion, becoming the first of many poor neighborhoods to go up in flames. Enter Ronald Reagan. The movie star had already morphed into a major power player in conservative political circles. And Reagan ran against Brown for the governorship, a devastatingly effective campaign. Essentially, he painted Brown and his big government vision as responsible for the chaos on campus, the breakdown of law and order on the streets. His big win was the first shot in the Reagan Revolution, and a sign that the 1968 race was not going to be as predictable as the Democratic liberals and Rockefeller Republicans had hoped it might be. So there was chaos on the home front and quagmire overseas. In January 1968, North Vietnamese forces launched a surprise offensive push over Tet, the Lunar New Year holiday. It hit with devastating force. Images of battle and destruction flashed over television screens and on the front pages of American newspapers. The situation in Vietnam opened up a political opportunity for anti-war Democrats to stake a claim for the White House. First up was Minnesota's junior senator, Eugene McCarthy. Gene McCarthy was a 51-year-old former college professor with a love for poetry and an impatience for petty legislative politics. One congressional colleague said that McCarthy was, quote, the most intelligent man in Congress, but he did not intend this to be a compliment. Lyndon Johnson had toyed with nominating McCarthy for vice president in 1964, but went with the other senator from Minnesota instead, Hubert H. Humphrey. By late 1967, McCarthy was bored with the Senate and deeply frustrated by the administration's conduct in Vietnam. He had college-age kids, and his kids and their friends urged him to run for president. And in December '67, he threw his hat in the ring and announced he was going to challenge Johnson. But the smart money at that point was still on the president. The first primary was in traditionally conservative New Hampshire, and polling data before the election indicated that McCarthy wasn't going to make much of a dent. Well, polls are sometimes wrong. When the final tally came in, Johnson won, but McCarthy came in only 7 percentage points behind. New York Senator Robert F. Kennedy was watching all of this unfold. The loathing between Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson is legendary. Bobby had played an instrumental role in the backroom dealing that got Johnson to become his brother Jack's running mate in 1960. But that did not mean that he and Johnson liked one another. During Kennedy's presidency, Bobby became Attorney General, and he and the Vice President continually butted heads. Kennedy once said of Johnson, quote, "In every conversation I have with him, he lies." I can't really quote much of what Johnson said about Kennedy here, because pretty much everything he said about him could not be printed in a family newspaper or repeated on broadcast television, and I don't want to incur FCC fines for the UW-TV. From the moment that Johnson became president, people around Robert Kennedy kept on floating the idea that he should run for the White House himself. And Kennedy's own politics were shifting during these years. His travels around the country made him increasingly focused on the problems of racial injustice and poverty. And he became strongly against the war. His experience in his brother's administration had made him suspicious of what military and intelligence leaders said and did. He watched with horror as the conflict escalated. McCarthy's near victory in New Hampshire showed Kennedy that anti-war sentiment was strong enough to possibly topple the president. An obscure senator from Minnesota couldn't do it, but a Kennedy, different matter. On March 16th, with loving wife and adorable children at his side, Kennedy held a press conference on Capitol Hill and announced he was running. His entry sealed Johnson's fate. Johnson already was running far behind McCarthy in the upcoming Wisconsin primary. He announced his withdrawal from the campaign 2 days before the Wisconsin vote, and it was a good thing he did. Johnson lost 2-1 to Eugene McCarthy. But with Wisconsin, things got more complicated. Johnson was gone, but McCarthy was showing himself to be a serious opponent to Kennedy. And then there was Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey. With the president out, he started to work the phones. He didn't want the Democratic establishment to commit to either of the anti-war candidates just yet. There were still 33 states that didn't have primaries in 1968, and where delegates couldn't be locked into the convention. Humphrey really didn't have to run in any primary, and he still could win the nomination if the party regulars were with him. Instead, he ran proxy candidates in the primary states so that his opponents couldn't get enough of the delegates to win. So it was a real three-way race, not the simple path that Kennedy would have hoped. Now, RFK was certainly number one when it came to attention from the media. Reporters who covered both brothers observed that their politics was an artful combination of grassroots constituency building and charismatic image making. And Robert Kennedy's 1968 campaign involved both, but the charismatic side of things really dominated. As he told a student audience early on in his campaign, the contest in 1968 is not for the rule of America, but for its heart. Kennedy's grasp of the politics of the heart showed itself 1 month later on the day that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis. King's death triggered violent convulsions of destruction in cities like Detroit, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. Other cities didn't go up in flames, thanks to the words and actions of charismatic leaders. In Indianapolis, Kennedy was that charismatic leader. Campaigning in a black neighborhood as the news came over the wire, he broke the story to his audience and gave an impromptu and very personal speech. He said to the agonized crowd, quote, "I can only say that I feel in my heart the same kind of feeling." And as if anyone needed reminding, he said, "I had a member of my own family killed." The reputation of Kennedy grew, especially among the under 25 generation. Posters of RFK became a dorm room staple. One sign in the crowd at a Kennedy rally read, "Bobby is groovy." Kennedy was able to knit together the different groups who were turning their backs on big politics and embracing identity politics. He was no longer a consensus liberal. He was a standard bearer for the new left. He had the youth and charisma to glue together these anxious and agitated interest groups into a larger cause. The primary season was full of tightly fought contests. Kennedy won Indiana, Nebraska, South Dakota. McCarthy won Pennsylvania and Massachusetts and Oregon. It came down to the California primary on June 5th. The winner of that would be the person who'd take on Humphrey for the nomination. Kennedy won California, narrowly. He gave a rousing victory speech just before midnight at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. And then, as he exited through the hotel kitchen, 6 shots fired out. Robert Kennedy was dead, killed by a gunman who was angry about his support of Israel. The nation again went into mourning, especially its young people. Crowds lined the tracks as the train bearing Kennedy's body rolled across the country from California to Arlington National Cemetery. With his death, the constellation of factions that was the New Left lost the leader, lost the glue that was sticking them together. And the assassination resonated nationally. The cover of Newsweek asked, "Has violence become an American way of life?" One newspaper columnist declared, "The country does not work anymore." Remember this, from 1963 to 1968, 3 icons, 2 Kennedys and 1 King, had been felled by assassins' bullets. The men to whom so many Americans had looked for hope and a difference were all killed in their prime. The depths of this trauma spilled through politics. It made some people want to abandon formal politics altogether. It made others want to find more bold, more radical solutions. Now let's move to the other side of the political spectrum. Back in 1967, when everyone assumed that the deeply unpopular Lyndon Johnson would be the Democratic nominee, the Republicans were starting to smell victory. But first, they needed to decide which side of the party was going to get to have its guy as the GOP standard bearer. For the moderates and the Rockefeller Republican types, the most appealing candidate was the governor of Michigan, George Romney. Romney had bipartisan appeal. He had won repeatedly in a heavily Democratic state, Michigan. Sometimes he even sounded like a Democrat. He once called America's worship of individualism, quote, nothing but a political banner to cover up greed. Jack Kennedy considered Romney a formidable opponent, telling a confidant that in 1964, when he ran for re-election, quote, the fellow I don't want to run against is Romney. However, it turned out that George Romney was not quite ready for prime time. When he started hitting the road to lay the groundwork for his presidential run, he started getting questions about policy matters he could not answer very well, especially on issue number one, Vietnam. At first, he said he wouldn't comment on the war until he had studied the issue further. But Romney was an earnest, forthright person who said what he thought. He made some offhand comments about how Republicans might handle Vietnam better because Johnson was, quote unquote, locked in to certain approaches. Reporters pounced. What do you mean? What are you trying to say? Romney didn't have a good answer. Eventually, Romney got tired of not having a good answer, and it got him into hot water. In September 1967, he told an interviewer, forthrightly, earnestly, honestly, that his earlier support for the war was the result of what generals and diplomats had told him when he'd visited there as a part of a delegation of governors a couple of years before. They were wrong, he had concluded. In fact, they'd given him, quote, the greatest brainwashing that anybody can get. Brainwashing. It was a mistake that sank his candidacy. That left one guy standing, and it was the unlikeliest of people, Richard M. Nixon. After 1962, Nixon had left public life and joined a New York law firm. His name still got floated as a possible presidential nominee, but Republicans of all stripes worried that Nixon was not electable. The moderates didn't like him. One of them, Senator Ed Brooke of Massachusetts, said if Nixon was the nominee, quote, it wouldn't be a contest in '68, we'd give it away. The conservatives didn't like his chances much either. Colorado Senator Pete Dominick, who was a great friend of Goldwater's, said, quote, he's the most qualified man, but can we win with a man who's lost twice? But they hadn't been paying attention to what Nixon had been doing for the past several years. After 1964, Nixon had started a quiet campaign to win over the hearts and minds of the Republican establishment and its new conservative flank, including the young people who had campaigned so fiercely for Barry Goldwater. He enlisted the help of some key advisors. A young press aide named Patrick Buchanan started planting stories in the national media that tried to change the narrative that Nixon was a political loser. He made his law partner, John Mitchell, his top advisor and fundraiser. Nixon called Mitchell the heavyweight. Although the season had started out with a host of Republican names in the mix, from conservative superstar Ronald Reagan to liberal New York Mayor John Lindsay, by the time that the GOP gathered in Miami in early August for its convention, it was clear that Richard Nixon was going to be the nominee. He got there exactly because he was neither a hero of the moderates nor a rising star of the conservatives. With the party split between the two, he found a way to straddle the middle, but with a decidedly conservative edge, because Richard Nixon had done the math. A survey of Republican delegates in 1968 had found that 75% of them identified as conservative. The Rockefellers and the Romneys got a lot of press attention, but the real heart of the GOP was starting to swing to the right. And here's another thing. The Republican Party was making inroads into the South, which previously had been solidly Democratic. Two things drove this change. One was civil rights. Many Southerners found the Democrats' support of federal civil rights legislation to be an intolerable betrayal. Republican operatives realized that civil rights presented an opportunity for their party to gain a significant block of Southern support. But they also realized that racist rhetoric would alienate other critical groups. For the second reason the GOP was growing in the South was because so many Northerners were moving there. In the decades after World War II, as companies and people moved to cities like Atlanta and Jacksonville and Houston and Dallas, these white-collar managers and executives of these companies moved with them. These are people who had a habit of voting Republican. They also had a strong dislike of the racist language of Southern politics. So Southern politicians started talking in code. They talked about the rights of homeowners and of independence from intrusive government mandates. They appealed to the fears that whites had about the new world of court-ordered busing, housing integration, and affirmative action. It was devastatingly effective. But it wasn't just the South that helped the conservative movement grow. When we think of the youth movements of the 1960s, the image that comes to mind is this: anti-war protests, cultural liberation, a new politics of the left, and this is very much what the 1960s was about. But the 1960s was also about this: other youth movements, where the hair wasn't long but stayed short, where no one was dropping out of college or taking drugs, where students marched in favor of the war, not against it. These young people listened to and participated in Up With People, the clean-cut singing troupe you see here. They joined Young Americans for Freedom, the campus conservative organization. Richard Nixon took note of this and played it to win. In early 1968, a memo started circulating around the Nixon campaign, written by a young staffer named Kevin Phillips, titled "Middle America and the Emerging Republican Majority." It explained how the great social upheavals of the 60s had created a new enemy. Phillips pointed out that the New Deal was successful by focusing people's anger on economic elites who had so much when others had so little. Franklin Roosevelt, despite being a one-percenter himself, played this so artfully and created an alternative vision. Now, people were angry at cultural elites, the experts in Washington who were telling ordinary people to put their kids on a bus and send them across town, who were telling people how to live their lives, who weren't cracking down on crime, who were tolerating drug use and bad behavior from those insolent college students. These folks listened to Lawrence Welk, not to Motown or the Doors. They went to church. They didn't go to anti-war demonstrations. In May, Nixon gave a national radio address where he gave these people a name. He called them the Silent Center. And he told them, a great many quiet Americans have become committed to answers to social problems that preserve personal freedom. Liberals in Washington had trampled on individual freedoms, ignored this silent majority. And even though Nixon was talking about a new majority, we also could look at his campaign as one that played off some of the same interest group and identity politics emerging on the left. For big politics had broken down on the right as well. People no longer believed what the leaders in Washington were selling them, what the experts were telling them to do. And after all of the changes of the past few years that affected them so personally, they no longer believed that we are all in it together. Just like the young people protesting the war and fighting for equal rights, Nixon raged against the consensus liberal establishment, and it worked. Now we come to the third part of tonight's story, the impact of television. By 1968, television had already changed American culture and changed American politics. Television networks started covering the conventions in 1948. Presidential campaigns started running TV ads in 1952. And TV was beaming the world into American living rooms. Wars, assassinations, strikes, new music, sexual liberation, you name it. Presidential candidates had been using television for a while by 1968, but politics lagged far behind Madison Avenue in its skill in crafting persuasive and sophisticated advertising. 1968 was the year that politics caught up. That's one reason TV is important. The other reason that TV mattered was when the campaign went off script. In 1968, television transmitted events that were unscripted, that were raw, where candidates and parties lost control of the message. And exhibit number one the Democratic Convention in Chicago. Since early that year, the anti-war left had been thinking and planning about how to use television to take on the establishment at the convention. They thought the Democratic Convention was this prime opportunity. In a memorandum drafted early that year, activist Tom Hayden outlined an opportunity for the left to win over disaffected voters. He wrote, "To the average Democrat who wants a say on the widening war, high taxes, and urban squalor, the choice will appear desperate. Many, for the first time, will wake up to the fact that in the wheeling and dealing of the democratic process, the average person does not count. His choices are limited to which of the stars he least dislikes. This summer, millions of anxious Democrats will ask, what now?" Hayden and his fellow activists thought they could provide an answer. Now, when Johnson dropped out of the race, momentum for a counter-protest slowed, but when Kennedy was killed, however, the plans went into overdrive. Others on the left also had their sights set on Chicago. Chief among them were Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin and their youth organizing party known as the Yippies. The Yippies specialized in getting attention by being outrageous and creating made-for-TV moments. At an anti-war march in 1967, Hoffman famously urged a group to sing and chant until the Pentagon levitated 300 feet in the air and turned orange. For the record, it didn't. But it made the news anyway. As Democrats converged on Chicago, 10,000 college kids and peaceniks and lefties and hippies and yippies gathered on the streets outside. And they were met with 20,000 police officers and soldiers. Because Democratic Chicago Mayor Richard J. Daley was hosting the convention, and he didn't want the long-haired kids disrupting it. So he responded to their protests with force. A later congressional investigation called the events a police riot and blamed the mayor for, quote, unrestrained and indiscriminate police violence. Every television network had huge teams of producers and reporters on the ground to cover the convention, and as Daley's police started cracking down on the protesters, the networks beamed out the action as it happened. The police, in turn, started beating up on the reporters. The chaos outside spilled into the convention hall itself. Television cut between action on the street and shots of Democrats turning on each other inside. Mayor Daley appeared on the convention floor, sticking to his guns, cursing wildly. From the podium, he was denounced for his Gestapo tactics. Reporters roamed the convention floor and interviewed anti-war delegates whose words undercut every attempt the party made to show unity. Delegates burst into tears on national television. They denounced their party's leaders and their position on the war. They stood on chairs and sang, "We shall overcome." Hubert Humphrey was furious. After all the infighting and trauma of the primary season, he and his people were working furiously to secure the delegates needed for the nomination. When it looked like they were going to pull it off, despite all the chaos inside and outside, he turned his fury on the television reporters. Sitting in his hotel room watching NBC, he reportedly shook his fist at the reporter on the screen, saying, "Don't forget, I'm going to be president someday, I'm going to appoint the FCC, and we're going to look into all of this." The convention ended with Humphrey as the nominee, but it deeply wounded the Democratic Party. In 1968, the Democrats lost control of the television narrative. Their political opponents used television to take control of the narrative. One of the big lessons Richard Nixon had taken from his run for president in 1960 was that television mattered. It mattered less what you said on television, it mattered more how you said it and how you looked when you said it. The debacle of Nixon's televised debates against John F. Kennedy became a staple of history textbooks. Nixon came off as shifty and sweaty in comparison to the smooth and handsome Kennedy. But another critical part of the television story in 1960 was how well Kennedy employed the tools of corporate advertising in his television commercials. He used snappy jingles and slogans that sold the candidate the same way that Kellogg's would sell a box of cereal. In contrast, Nixon played by the rules. His TV spots were similar to those of the politicians who came before him. They were serious, they were substantive, they appealed to the head, not to the heart. Let's take a look at a Nixon ad from 1960.
What is the most important issue confronting the American people in this election campaign? There's no question about the answer that I have found in traveling all over this nation. Above everything else, the American people want leaders who will keep the peace without surrender for America and the world. Henry Cabot Lodge and I have had the opportunity of serving with President Eisenhower in this cause for the last 7.5 years. We both know Mr. Khrushchev. We have sat opposite the conference table with him. We know what peace demands. We will keep America the strongest nation in the world, and we will couple that strength with firm diplomacy. No apologies, no regrets. Always willing to negotiate for peace, but never conceding anything without getting a concession in return. Vote for Nixon and Lodge, November 8th.
So how many of you would have, during that commercial, gotten up to go get a beer from the fridge or take a bathroom break? It's not riveting television. And all of Nixon's ads in 1960 were like that, so sitting on the edge, awkwardly on the edge of a desk, talking for a minute about some issue. As Nixon geared up for his political comeback, he turned to Madison Avenue to help him transform his image. He hired a group of experienced advertising executives to craft a media strategy. One of them, Harry Treleaven, wrote a series of memoranda that examined how to play down Nixon's disadvantages and play up his strengths. Treleaven wrote of Nixon, "Not always loved, he is universally respected. He does have a certain star quality going for him." Incidentally, there was another key aide working on this Nixon campaign makeover, a young TV producer named Roger Ailes, who would go on to transform television journalism as the president of Fox News. Treleaven and Ailes and their colleagues realized they could play up the candidate's star quality on television by carefully scripting what Nixon was asked and who could ask it. They could place him in informal settings. They could avoid close-ups. They could use Nixon's voice in a disembodied voiceover instead of using video of the candidate himself. The result was a series of campaign ads that were a 180-degree turn from what Nixon put on television in 1960. They were loud, they were jarring, they were fast-paced. They were, in fact, quite different from pretty much any other commercial on television during that time. Let's take a look.
Never has so much military, economic, and diplomatic power been used so ineffectively as in Vietnam. If after all of this time and all of this sacrifice and all of this support, there is still no end in sight, then I say the time has come for the American people to turn to new leadership, not tied to the policies and mistakes of the past. I pledge to you, we shall have an honorable end to the war in Vietnam.
This commercial was one of several like it, and they had the impact that Nixon's people intended. They presented the candidate simultaneously as fresh and new and modern, and as a wise and experienced defender of traditional values. It was the perfect combination for 1968. Now, it wasn't just Republicans who used the liberal implosion to create a new and powerful message in the later months of the 1968 campaign. Both media and message came together in the campaign of another pivotal figure, Alabama Governor George Wallace. A Democrat, Wallace first ran for Alabama governor in 1958 as a racial moderate. He rejected the endorsement of the Ku Klux Klan and accepted the endorsement of the NAACP. He lost. After that defeat, Wallace's racial attitudes transformed. In 1962, he ran again for governor and won. He became a staunch defender of segregation. And he had a flair for theatrical gestures that generated media attention and gave him a national profile. He protested integration by literally standing at the door of the University of Alabama building to block its first 2 black students from registering, giving a fiery speech that made the national television newscasts. He first ran for the Democratic nomination for president in 1964, and in 1968 he ran again. The victory of Humphrey at the convention propelled Wallace to leave the Democrats behind and run as an independent, third-party candidate. Wallace's platform was a harsher and more undiluted version of Nixon's message to the silent majority. He condemned both the Republicans and the Democrats for abandoning the interests of the common people. Here's Wallace talking to an audience in Madison Square Garden in the last week of the campaign. Both national parties have kowtowed to every anarchist that has roamed the streets. I'm not talking about race. The overwhelming majority of all races in this country are against the breakdown of law and order. Wallace talked about how elitist PhD types were stomping on the rights of ordinary folks. He talked about crime, busing, unemployment, all the things that working-class Americans in both the South and the North were really worrying about. He wasn't talking about race, but really, he was. And he put this message on television. Let's take a look.
Why are more and more millions of Americans turning to Governor Wallace? Follow as your children are bused across town.
As president, I shall, within the law, turn back the absolute control of the public school systems to the people of the respective states.
Why are more and more millions of Americans turning to Governor Wallace? Take a walk in your street or park tonight.
As president, I shall help make it possible for you and your families to walk the streets of our cities in safety.
Why are more and more millions of Americans turning to Governor Wallace? Watch your hard-earned tax dollars sail away to anti-American countries.
As president, I will halt the giveaway of your American dollars and products to those nations that aid our enemies.
Wallace has the courage to stand up for America. Give him your support.
So it's a blunter, more undiluted message, but the actual content of the messages are familiar to us in 2012. Talking about these issues, these economic insecurities, these intrusions of government onto individual rights. Wallace is crafting the architecture of this very powerful and resonant conservative message that is so successful because it plays to the very real fears and discontents of large numbers of the electorate. The Wallace third-party insurgency was damaging to both Nixon and to Humphrey. It pulled away some disaffected Southerners and disgruntled members of the silent majority who might have otherwise voted for the Republican, and it presented an alternative for Democrats who felt that the party had given in on civil rights. Richard Nixon played to these voters as well, but it's important to remember that his 1968 campaign still reflected the overall leftward tilt of politics in 1968. In 2012, we are living in a political world where the right is very far to the right, the middle is conservative-leaning. Richard Nixon was a relatively conservative candidate in '68, enough that he had to pick a known Republican moderate, Spiro Agnew, as his running mate to burnish his moderate credentials. But if we look at what Nixon said as a candidate and what he did as president, we'd see a politician who in many respects sounds and acts like what we'd call a liberal. Nixon campaigned on an honorable end to Vietnam, but on getting America out with some of its dignity intact, not escalating further in order to do it. He campaigned on crime and law and order, but in the first 2 years of his presidency, he enacted critical environmental laws and proposed a relatively generous welfare reform program, more generous than any of his Democratic presidential successors. On November 5th, 1968, the verdict was clear. Nixon won 301 electoral votes, Humphrey 191. Wallace hacked away at the Solid South, winning 5 Southern states and their 45 electoral votes. Now, the popular vote was much closer, reflecting the impact of Wallace's third-party campaign. Nixon won 43.4%, Humphrey 42.7%, and Wallace got 13.5% of the popular vote. This also shows the stark difference between electoral math and popular math, because elections in the US are won with electoral votes, and those gave Nixon a decisive win. It was an extraordinary year. And in many ways, we are still fighting the battles of 1968. Let's return to where we started. Why was 1968 a pivotal election? One, the liberals destructed. The old Cold War consensus liberalism fell apart in 1968. In its place was a fractured and often antagonistic identity politics divided along lines of race, ethnicity, gender, and age. In 1968, Americans started to question and attack big politics, just in the same way they were questioning big science or big business or big technology or big government. And the chief political victims of this were the Democratic Party leaders who had been in charge. The conservatives construct. In 1968, the broad-based business conservatism of the post-war Republican Party started to morph into the cultural conservatism of the post-civil rights era. Now, the religious right was not yet a significant force, but the debates of 1968 started to make cultural and moral issues fair game in national politics in new and really important ways. Similarly, trends in white working class voting in today's America follow a pattern begun by the upheavals of 1968. In the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt appealed to working class identity as Americans. He promised these voters jobs and homes and economic security, and they faithfully voted Democratic in return. Starting in the late 1960s, Republicans appealed to this group's identities as homeowners, or as suburbanites, or as churchgoers. They promised these voters law and order and a return to traditional values and the protection of individual rights. And these voters voted Republican in return. Third, television. 1968 was so powerful because of the unvarnished television moments, as well as the slickly packaged ones. It also proved that the candidate in the party who kept control of the television narrative had a big advantage on election day. Victory in '68 went to the guy who so many thought was a loser, but who transformed his image through careful and strategic use of television. In the 44 years since, we have packaged pretty much everything. The unvarnished TV moments are pretty hard to find. Now we find these moments on the internet, on viral video, at times when the candidates don't think the cameras are on. Ultimately, the story of 1968 is important, not because it just explains 1968, it explains what comes afterwards. In 1972, the wounds of 1968 were still visible throughout the Democratic Party. At the Democratic Convention, rabidly conservative supporters of George Wallace, who was once again running, yelled down the dashiki-clad delegates supporting liberal African-American Congresswoman Barbara Jordan. The Democratic Party was a much bigger tent, much more open to new voices, but it had lost the establishment power it had held so tightly from the New Deal through the Johnson years. George McGovern tried to be the glue that could bind all of these interests together, but he couldn't turn that into electoral victory in 1972. Meanwhile, the Republican Party had found a new way to talk to voters and had made inroads into critical parts of the old Democratic base. So the real endpoint of the 1968 election, then, is not on November 5th, 1968, but on November 4th, 1980. Ronald Reagan's landslide victory over Democratic incumbent Jimmy Carter was a triumph of all the politics tested by Nixon in '68. Reagan had extraordinary powers of communication, an ability to persuade, to inspire voters. He picked up the Democratic voters who were disaffected by cultural change, and he added Democrats who had been battered by the economy of the 1970s. Together, these voting blocs made the Reagan Revolution happen. The outlines of 2012's red state and blue state map started to emerge in 1968. They solidified in 1980. In the 30 years since the election of Reagan, however, many other things happened to change the political landscape, the economic landscape, the social landscape, the cultural landscape, and to change the personalities and the issues that drove the two major political parties. History did not stand still. So next week, for our fourth and final Pivotal Tuesday, we'll explore what these were, why they mattered, and put everything together in understanding how the stories of elections of the past inform elections present and help shape our nation of the future. Thank you very much. And for those of you who would like to stay and ask some questions or listen to questions, I invite you to, we're going to turn the lights up. Those who need to leave are welcome to go. No debate competing for airtime today, but I'd be happy to take your questions and keep the conversation going. So there are microphones in the aisle for any who are interested. Well, perhaps we can, I will stay up and, oh, I have someone there. All right, go for it.
That just made me think, were you tempted to put in 1980?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Were you tempted to put in 1980?
Who?
The election of 1980, was that a temptation for you to include that instead of these four?
Oh, yes. Thank you for asking. 1980 almost, you know, it was definitely a pivotal election, and this was the great dilemma in choosing which ones to do. And I didn't choose 1980 in part because I think that the foundations of 1980 and 1980 is understood through the lens of 1968. In a way, the two elections are very similar. They both end with Republican victories, but two very different men. But you know, Ronald Reagan is already a major figure, and his ideas are already in play. So in a way, they're two. You know, were I to include both of them, it would have been repeating myself, and so I decided to. I didn't quite flip a coin, but I decided to go with 68. Yeah.
I was curious in your research if you found out that Richard Nixon, when he was campaigning in 68, sent an envoy to the Paris peace talks to delay the talks so that they wouldn't be settled until he was elected.
I've heard that, and I can't off the top of my head elaborate on that in the way that it deserves, but this does give me an entry to, an opportunity to plug the website of further resources I've put together, which includes more in-depth books about the Vietnam War, the Vietnam conflict, the 60s, the Johnson presidency, the Nixon presidency, and some of the other characters in the race, and also has links to the commercials that I showed tonight and other campaign commercials. If you really want to go down that rabbit hole, there's a marvelous website called The Living Room Candidate, put together by the Museum of Moving Image in New York. So all that can be found on my Pivotal Tuesdays website, which you can get to by going to my faculty homepage. So thank you for that question. I'm sorry I can't answer it better.
During this period, or shortly thereafter, the process of choosing delegates really began to change.
Yeah.
And how activists sort of congregated around that and dominated that process. Mm-hmm. And in your opinion, how much of that is responsible for the bitter partisanship that we now see every day on TV?
That's a good question. Well, I think the bitter partisanship we see is a result of a lot of different things. Part of it is that the way in which that we certainly elect our members of Congress, as you know, the borders of districts have been drawn so that you have fewer swing districts and you have more that are firmly Democratic or Republican, and thus people win by playing to the base and being, the more extreme you are, the better. So the bipartisan compromisers don't get as much traction. What happened in 1968, of course, prompted the Democratic Party to reform the way it chose its president. And the 1972 convention was a result of that reform, and you have a series, and then the Republicans follow on. So the fact that Hubert Humphrey could get the nomination without having run in primaries was something that was just so, people were so bitter about. I mean, it really kind of went against people's notions of democracy, even though that was the way things have been working forever. But it does explain, the kind of fracturing of America, the splitting up into interest group-driven politics. I mean, people have, interest groups have existed for a long time. Herbert Hoover was playing with interest groups down in the 1920s. But the real kind of people thinking, well, I'm voting, the reason I'm voting this way is because of the color of my skin or because of my gender or my sexual orientation. And the people with whom I feel closest to are the people who are like me in that way, and other people can't understand. That is very much a politics that comes out of the 60s and is a response to this kind of blanket, liberalism that said, come on, doesn't everyone feel like Vietnam is a great thing to do because we're trying to contain the Soviet Union? I mean, the kind of arrogance of the leaders in Washington that presumed that everyone in America, that America was sort of this land of opportunity, and it really wasn't, and that everyone would kind of go along to get along because we all believed in this common cause. So that splintering apart, and then the other thing, and I'm going to talk about this more on next Tuesday, is the end of mass culture, where you go from having 3 television networks in 1968, right, where everyone's watching Laugh-In and there's this common experience of culture that people have, to now, how many, we have a proliferation of cable networks, and then you have internet, and then you have all these other sources of information. So one of the things that drives polarization is we're able to be in this entertainment information echo chamber where you don't have to, where you can have the views that you already hold reinforced. And that you also can really tailor and personalize everything you do, but depending on what sort of phone you have, to what car you drive, to who you vote for. Everything is a consumer product. So it's starting to come in motion. But the selection of delegates is kind of part of this larger set of processes. Thanks.
You may have a very simple, straightforward answer to this question. I recently finished Means of Ascent.
Yes.
Good for you. Which, of course, describes Johnson's theft of the 1948 senatorial race. Describes Johnson basically as a completely self-serving political animal who'll do anything to gain power and wield it. Very different than the Johnson in 1968 who decides to give it up. Is it really just in the face of RFK's competition, or what explains it? Could it simply be Vietnam?
He gives it up because he realizes Vietnam's going to keep him from winning. He is tired, but he is a consummate deal maker. I think it's reflective that someone like Robert Caro, who's devoted how many decades to chronicling Johnson's life in 4 books and counting, characterizes him as this sort of, this kind of low down and dirty political guy, which he was to his core. So to say that he's, putting politics aside and fighting for the higher power, like he's looking at the polls. He's realizing that he is damaged. That you have pretty much this nobody, Gene McCarthy, who is running a really strong campaign against him, and that he is being so consumed by the Vietnam War. That being said, I think he was genuinely just torn apart and destroyed by Vietnam. That it wasn't just a political calculus saying, I can't win this thing, so I'm getting out. This was something that just kind of unmoored him, he was never the same after. And he went from being this extraordinary, sort of the most powerful guy to being broken by it. And it really, you kind of hear we have these presidential recordings of Johnson and these conversations, and just sort of him kind of jawing on the phone with his friends and his colleagues about this, and you see this sort of progression and how they're getting deeper and deeper, and they just don't know how to get out. It's really heartbreaking, really heartbreaking. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
I'm curious to know Eugene McCarthy's reaction to Robert Kennedy's entrance into it seems like McCarthy had sort of, in spite of all the odds against him, had sort of picked up the banner.
Yeah.
And then this Johnny-come-lately comes flying in and, sort of pulls the rug out from my man.
Yeah. Well, he definitely, Lyndon Johnson wasn't the only guy who disliked Bobby Kennedy, and he generally was. A lot of his colleagues in Congress and beyond really didn't like him very much, and thought he was kind of an arrogant so-and-so. Now, generally speaking, senators, as a rule, tend to sort of veer on the arrogant side of the spectrum anyway, and have a pretty healthy sense of self. And Gene McCarthy was not immune from that. And some of his colleagues thought he was, a so-and-so as well. I think he saw, he wanted to fight. He realized by that point, part of it was timing. He got in early enough, and he got in these early primaries, Kennedy dithered a bit. And so he didn't get his name on the ballot in Wisconsin in time. He really was coming a little late to the game. And by that point, McCarthy had got a really decent traction. And Kennedy definitely had more star power, and he had these reporters following him worshipfully. And but that might have overstated his actual ability to get votes. In a way, it's a sort of similar phenomenon that Teddy Roosevelt had in 1912, where he has everyone following his every move, but he couldn't really translate. The real political support wasn't at the same scale. So McCarthy saw that he really had a chance, and that it was going to be, it was a three-way race, and he was in it to win it, and it was very close. It was very competitive, and there's a lot of what ifs in 1968. What if Kennedy had not been killed? But California was decisive, and Kennedy did win it. So it would have been interesting to see how McCarthy would have played in the rest of the race after that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. While this was all going on, and you were talking about both parties moving away from the big consensus vision. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking the whole time, Presidents Eisenhower and Truman were both alive. Mm-hmm. And did they endorse a certain faction? Like, did Truman ever endorse the Kennedy ticket or the McCarthy, or what did that even play at this election?
Well, as often happens, the lions of the older generation of the party kind of stayed out of it, in part because it was so fractious. And they were, it's interesting because both, the kind of, both Democrat, both the Truman and the Eisenhower vision is something that's coming under fire in 1968. And they aren't really necessarily endorsements that you want to trot out all the time. But they do, they do their due diligence. I know more about kind of Truman's relationship with Johnson than I do about what happens with the candidates in 68. But they were around, but they were representing an older generation, and this was very much, what they did and said was less important than what the new generation was saying or doing. Yeah. Well, thank you all very much, and again, if you want to, thanks. And if you'd like to come up and ask me any questions, you're welcome to. I'll stay on stage for a little bit. Thanks.